So my thesis is the ELSA project in 2 primary schools, reflections from key stakeholders on the factors that influence implementation. So essentially in my project, I examined the reflections of key stakeholders relative to the organisation and implementation of the ELSA project in 2 mainstream primary schools that have been involved with the project for different periods of time. So the rationale for this piece of research, so implementation is essentially what an intervention consists of when it's enacted in a setting. So it's the process by which an intervention is put into practice. Implementation research is really essential because the way interventions are implemented, for example, whether there's a high degree of fidelity with the course manual, or which young people in settings access the intervention, in addition to the conditions under which they are implemented, have been linked to the outcomes of intervention. So whether there are positive outcomes for young people from that intervention. So the ELSA project is the Emotional Literacy Support Assistant project, and over 100 local authorities are now delivering this project in the UK, so it's really important that it's rigorously researched. However, I conducted a systematic review of the ELSA literature base, which highlighted that very little is actually known about how this project is implemented, particularly in mainstream primary schools, with no research yet deliberately examining that topic. Okay, so the research questions, I identified 2 main research questions of this study, which are: how is the ELSA project implemented in primary school settings, and what are the facilitators and barriers to effective implementation at different stages of implementation? So I identified various sub-research questions as well, including the nature of support provided for ELSAs in the school environment, the nature of the referral process, what finishing an ELSA intervention looks like in practice, and the extent to which staff are aware and have knowledge of that intervention, the extent that the school ethos and system acts as a facilitator or barrier, and also how these facilitators and barriers differ across different stages of implementation. So implementation research essentially highlights that implementation is a process and not an event. So part of my research was looking at schools who had implemented ELSA for different periods of time. Okay, so the methods of this study. I adopted a mixed methods comparative multiple case study design in order to best address the research questions of this study. I conducted one-to-one semi-structured interviews with various key stakeholders in each school. And you can see the list there of the people who were included. So the ELSA, SENCO ELSA line manager, a member of the SLT, 2 teachers, and a link EP and an EP ELSA supervisor. Interview data were analysed thematically in line with Braun and Clark, and I also disseminated a short questionnaire to wider school staff in order to address that sub-research question about the extent of their awareness and understanding of the ELSA intervention in their setting. So in line with Yin's model, I conducted and analysed the cases separately, and in order to kind of retain integrity of the cases, and then drew cross-case conclusions in the final stage. Okay, so now onto the findings. So obviously I don't have time to go through kind of all of the themes and sub-themes, so I'm just going to highlight a few key findings which I think will be kind of interest to you. So looking at the pink box for school 2, so the school ethos, priorities and values and its impact on ELSA practices. The ethos of the school was found to really clearly impact practices in place. So in school 1, there was a really strong mental health ethos. So as this quote, the link EP said, mental health is definitely high on their agenda. They've been involved in various projects, and I think ELSA just fits really neatly into that ethos. So within school 1, there's this real sense that ELSA was a subsystem contributing to this whole school primary task of supporting children and young people's mental health. And within this ethos, they adopted a very comprehensive approach to the ELSA model with a high level of protection of the ELSA's time, space and resources. Coming over to the yellow box, the central role of attachment was found between the ELSA and the pupil. And within this relationship, the pupils and the ELSA found endings. ELSA endings are a really difficult process. So the ELSA explained, she was so lovely once I started doing it, I thought, how am I going to say goodbye to this child? How am I going to end with this child? So there was this really strong sense in the data of these difficulties and these endings. And for this reason, School 1 adopted a range of practices to support the endings. And this included things like ongoing contact with the ELSA, but it also involved actually the intervention running on somewhat longer than the ELSA guidance outlines. So in our school, ELSA generally does run on for at least a term. And that extended length was essentially the stakeholders explained to support the ending of that relationship, so to give ample time for that ending to take place. And then just coming on to, and then just to highlight the green theme at the bottom, just data really highlighted the potential emotional impact of the intervention work on the ELSAs and the importance of their support system as well. Okay, so coming on to School 2 findings thematic map. The identifying pupils for ELSA in the top left. In School 1, a range of diverse pupil needs access to ELSA. However, in School 2, those who accessed ELSA had quite similar needs, and they were those with complex externalizing behavioural needs. So one stakeholder described one of the pupils accessing ELSA as, I think there were double figures of adults that he'd hurt within a week. And then coming over to the light blue theme, the ELSA remit. So in School 2, there was also a nurture style provision in place. And the school had difficulties kind of distinguishing between and incorporating the nurture style provision and the ELSA intervention. And within this school, ELSA often operated in a reactive way. So seeing it as the dumping ground for naughty children and send them to the ELSA if they're being naughty. So they weren't necessarily running those block interventions. And these difficulties appeared related to a lack of school-wide understanding of the ELSA project's primary task. So although the questionnaire data highlighted that 96% of wider staff are aware of the intervention, interview data really highlighted kind of staff-wide misconceptions about the role. So the Senko explained, I don't really, people see the difference between the ELSA in her ELSA role and in her role in the nurture style provision. And just coming on to the yellow box finally here, so the central role of attachment came out really strongly for School 2 as well. And actually in School 2 there was an absence of ELSA intervention ending, so it doesn't seem that there's an end point for any of these children, the EP supervisor said. And this appeared to relate to difficulties with overdependence on the ELSA and also difficulties separating from the ELSA for those pupils. So the ELSA said, even if I can hide myself somewhere, they still find me, and if they don't see me, it causes problems. Okay, so just briefly summarising, what are the facilitators and barriers to the effective implementation of the project. Actually, I'll just quickly say that obviously both the schools implemented ELSA in quite different ways, and that was one of the kind of key findings that I took away, and that barriers potentially appeared more prominent in the earlier implementation stages. So thank you. And then, so what are the facilitators and barriers? The facilitators are things like a mental health ethos, practices and endings which acknowledge the importance of that ELSA-pupil attachment, a clear remit, and then barriers are things like difficulties distinguishing between ELSA and other SEMH provision, blurring of ELSA role boundaries, emotional impact of the work. So drawing on the findings of my study, I developed an implementation resource which schools can use to provide different considerations and different stages of implementation that they're in. So it provides guidance relevant to what implementation stage they're in, and also provides kind of suggestions of, I'm encountering difficulties at different stages and what they could do. So the local authority that I'm currently on placement, and they've shared this with their ELSA schools and they're adopting it, and hopefully they're finding that helpful. And obviously it could be kind of adapted in light of further research that supports it. And then just to think about some further implications. I mean, I think this project really highlighted that schools can implement ELSA differently, and so the importance of future efficacy research to look at how the project is implemented. So we can't generalize from the positive outcomes of one school's ELSA intervention to another unless we know how that project's been implemented. The ELSA model could also be amended to involve a link EP consultation with key stakeholders. So this study highlighted that the link EP role is a really valuable but inconsistently received avenue of support. So the model could be amended to involve a link EP consultation while the school are in the early stages of implementation, although obviously further research to support that would be beneficial. And then the last implication is just around including more references to attachment theory, given the strong given the relevance of this to the ELSA project, making that more prominent within the training, and then also, more time in the training to also consider the importance of the endings and like this attachment relationship. Okay, thank you.